Hey everybody, welcome back to World History. This is our first section of chapter 17 on the Enlightenment. So go ahead and get your fill-in-the-blank notes pulled up on your Chromebooks and let's get started. All right. So this first section, primarily we're going to be looking at like the philosophy side of things. We're not really going to be looking at how the Enlightenment was put into practice, but we will be looking at a lot of the big ideas that we're going to need to understand going forward for the rest of this chapter, next chapter, and even into next semester. So if you remember all the way back to chapter 13, we talked about the scientific revolution. Well, it's going to spark the Enlightenment. It convinced educated Europeans of the power of human reason, and one of those ideas being natural law, rules discoverable by reason, like gravity and magnetism. You can reasonably understand those. Using science, reformers are going to set out to study human behavior as well as solve the problems of society. Immanuel Kant, a very famous philosopher, is going to be the first to call this the Enlightenment. All right. So two important people we need to talk about, Thomas Hobbes, and then we'll talk about John Locke in a minute. Thomas Hobbes wrote a book called Leviathan and argued that people were naturally cruel, greedy, and selfish, so that we were the worst, and stated that people entered into a social contract, or an agreement by which people give up their freedom to an organized society. They believed that only a powerful government could ensure an orderly society. We'll talk more about Hobbes' ideas in practice later on in the chapter, but this is kind of just an introduction for now. John Locke was a lot more optimistic about human nature. He claimed that they had natural rights. These are rights that belong to a human at birth. He wrote a book called The Two Treaties of Government and argued that people formed governments to protect their natural rights. He also stated that if a government failed to meet that obligation, they had the right to overthrow the government. Locke's ideas are heavily going to inspire the American Revolution, which we'll talk about in section 3. So moving on, primarily we're going to be focusing on philosophers or philosophes from France. These were French thinkers who embraced the Enlightenment. Again, this loosely translates to philosophers. Famous philosophes include Baron de Montesquieu, Voltaire, Denis Diderot, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. We're going to talk about all of them. Starting with Baron de Montesquieu. He's one of the earliest figures in the Enlightenment, actually. He's actually going to study the governments of Europe from Italy to England from the beginning of history and compare what went well, what went wrong, what could have been improved upon. He wrote the book, The Spirit of Laws, and discussed those governments throughout history. He felt the best way to protect liberty was to divide various functions and powers of government among 3 branches, a legislative, an executive, and a judicial. Sound familiar? Montesquieu is the one that gave the United States the idea for our 3 branches of the federal government, as well as checks and balances, which believed that each branch should be able to serve as a check on the other 2's powers. These are all big ideas that are still practiced today in places like the United States, in France, in England, in majority of European countries, actually. Voltaire is probably the most famous of the bunch, and he went on record at one point saying, "My trade is to say what I think." Voltaire wasn't afraid to call somebody out on their baloney. He's going to use sarcasm to expose government abuses and corruption, and target corrupt officials and idle aristocrats that weren't doing anything. He battled inequality, injustice, and superstition. And he also detested the slave trade and religious prejudice. Really, he thought that all humans were equal. Voltaire's writings often offended both the French government and the Catholic Church. He'd actually be imprisoned and exiled from France. And his books are going to be outlawed and burned. But Voltaire is still one of the most popular philosophers of them all. His work is was still being heavily read and shared, and people really supported what he was saying. All right, Diderot. He's actually going to write a 28-volume encyclopedia, that giant book, and his purpose was to change the general way of thinking by explaining topics like government, philosophy, and religion. It included articles by leading thinkers like Montesquieu and Voltaire, and articles by the philosophers had denounced slavery, praised the freedom of expression, and urged education for all. They also attacked divine right theory and traditional religions, mainly saying how problematic they had been towards the rights of the people. The French government argued that it was an attack on public morals, and the Pope threatened to excommunicate any Roman Catholics who either bought or read the book. But it's still one of the most important pieces of literature to come out of this point in time because, think about it, we all use the encyclopedias today. All right, Rousseau. He believed that people in their natural state were basically good, and felt this good was corrupted by the evils of society, especially the unequal distribution of property. He's going to write a book, The Social Contract, that felt that society placed too many limitations on people's behavior, believed any controls should be minimal, and that only a freely elected government should impose those controls. His big thing was putting faith in the general will of the people. This actually influenced political and social thinkers for more than 200 years. It's still pretty common to look at Rousseau's thoughts today when looking at government. Now, it's important to understand at this point in history, the Philosophs didn't apply their thoughts of freedom and equality to women. Mary Wollstonecraft actually is going to write a book, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, and call for equal education for boys and girls. The idea of women's equality is going to pretty much be ridiculed and sharply condemned and massively disregarded. Not only were there changes in this philosophy, there was also new economic thinkings as well. French philosophers known as physiocrats focused on economic reforms specifically. Just like the Philosophs, they also based their thinking on natural laws. They rejected the idea of mercantilism, which we've been talking about the last couple chapters, and instead they urged a policy of laissez-faire, or essentially allowing businesses to operate with little or no government influence. So basically, they're left on their own. They also supported free trade and opposed things like tariffs. Scottish economist Adam Smith is going to write The Wealth of Nations, that argues that the free market should be allowed to regulate business activity. It showed how manufacturing, trade, wages, profits, and economic growth were all linked to supply and demand. He did believe that the government had a duty to protect society, administer justice, and provide public works as well. Basically, just helping out where needed, but staying out of business. All right, so that is it for your notes for today. Your assignment is the Chapter 17 web quest, which is posted on Google Classroom. I'll see y'all guys next time. Bye, everybody.